The dust of the Mediterranean rose in a column as Roman legions marched along the road. Iron melted in the sun, skin on shoulders cracked, lips in blood. And all for what? For white grains for which people died more often than for gold. Why did salt, the simplest of earthly substances, decide the fate of entire armies? Why did a Roman legionary consider it no less valuable than a sword? And what made it a symbol of life itself? The answer is hidden in the word from which the modern salary originated. Historians wrote that already in the era of the Republic, long before the appearance of emperors, soldiers were given part of their pay not in coins but in salt. Thus arose the term salarium, from the Latin sal, salt. This was not just a product, but a means of survival, a measure of labor, and an indicator of status. Without salt, warriors lost not only the taste of food, but also strength, because it retained moisture in the body, and saved from dehydration in the hot campaigns of North Africa and Syria. In Roman sources of Tacitus and Pliny, it is mentioned that soldiers could receive up to half of their monthly allowance precisely in salt. For many it meant more than money. Coins could be lost, but without salt, one could die. Salt is the blood of the earth, the legionaries said. It whitened on their skin when sweat turned into a crust on bronze and helmet, reminding each crystal is worth a drop of sweat shed under the sun. This white powder was a strategic weapon. When Rome conducted sieges, salt works were captured first of all. The loss of a salt source was considered a catastrophe, comparable to the demise of an entire garrison. Archaeologists in Ostia and Pompeii found remains of warehouses where dozens of amphorae with salt were stored, guarded as strictly as the treasury.
That is why the word salarium became a symbol of stability and power.
Rome understood, he who controls salt controls the army and therefore the empire. For without soldiers capable of marching under the sun, there would be neither roads nor aqueducts nor Rome itself. Salt nourished muscles, sharpened the taste of life and discipline, every gram like a drop of power. When a legion went on campaign, salt went ahead of it, in the backs of supply trains, in the consciousness of warriors, in the very breath of the empire. It was an invisible commander who decided who would live to see battle and who would fall in the desert even before the first clash of swords. And in this fragile balance between salt and death lies the key to how one empire was able to subjugate the world. For Rome conquered not only with the sword, it held power with salt. But to understand how it saved armies on the brink of destruction, one must look into the campaigns, where every step on the scorched earth was worth more than gold. The midday sun mercilessly beat down on the bronze. Heat billowed over the desert, and from beyond the horizon came the smell of sweat, iron and leather. Roman legions marched through North Africa. Their steps, according to the historian Polybius, thundered like a war drum, steady, confident, without pause. Each legionary carried about 30 kilograms, armor, sword, shield, spear, daily rations, a water flask, and a small pouch of white grains that meant life. These grains were salt, the true fuel of the empire. Rome's army organization astonished even its enemies. Every 10th soldier was responsible for supplying water and salt. Without this, the legion would not move a single step. These warriors were called quaestores, quartermasters, responsible for provisions and pay. The role resembled modern logistics officers. They did not fight on the front lines, but it was precisely on them that the army's ability to march tomorrow depended. Chronicles state that the loss of salt en route was considered a military catastrophe. The heat turned the ground underfoot into a scorching pan, sweat streamed down faces, and armor clung to bodies. The Roman diet included dried meat, grain, olive oil, and a little wine. But without salt, all of this became useless. Muscles cramped, the body lost moisture, consciousness blurred. Archaeologists found remnants of clay vessels with salt at encampment sites, sealed with wax to prevent it from dissolving due to humidity, a soldier's life supply. When the legions moved east into Syria, Palestine, Armenia, heat and disease decimated the ranks no less effectively than swords. Livy wrote that a single lost salt convoy could cost an entire cohort. Cohorts are combat units of 500 soldiers. Without salt, they faced death from exhaustion and dehydration, for warriors lost moisture faster than they could replenish it with water. Then improvisation came into play. Salt was extracted from saline springs. Seawater was boiled down, white residue was scraped from rocks. From these crystals, not only a food additive, but also medicine was made. Salt was applied to wounds to prevent infection, and eyes were washed with it when sand burned them in the wind. It stung, but it saved. Each legionary carried in their loculus, a marching bag, a small pouch of salt as a symbol of personal salvation. It was not just food, it was a ritual. Before battle, mixing salt with bread, warriors uttered words addressed to Mars: "Protect the taste of life." Even at the moment when death stood near, they felt the taste of salt, the taste of Rome. But behind these rituals stood a harsh economy. Salt was expensive. Its delivery across the Alps and the Sahara cost the empire enormous sums. According to various sources, a ton of salt cost as much as a moderately skilled slave. Because of this, Rome built entire roads via salaria, salt roads, along which convoys carried the strategic commodity. Remains of these roads have survived to this day, and archaeologists find along them mule bones and metal buckles, traces of convoys that perished from the heat. Rome understood: to lose gold unpleasant, to lose salt deadly. Therefore, the guarding of the salt roads was entrusted to the best, centurions. A centurion is an officer who commanded approximately 100 soldiers. Their task was not just to guard the convoys, but also to ensure that no one stole salt from their own. Theft of salt was considered treason. The guilty were punished publicly, with whips, sometimes with death. For the fate of an entire legion depended on their action. Salt became the invisible currency of the empire. With it, one could buy forgiveness, power, life. When soldiers received their salarium, they knew each handful, not just payment, but the trust of Rome. The white powder maintained order better than the fear of the sword, for whoever lost salt lost strength, status, and the very possibility of being a Roman. But there were times when even Rome could not keep salt under control. When the desert or the enemy cut off the roots, what historians called the salt famine began. Then the army turned into shadows of themselves. And to understand how this invisible crisis almost destroyed the greatest army in the world, one must see how salt once became a weapon against Rome itself. The thunder of hooves, the cries of mules, the smell of rotting leather, thus began the catastrophe which contemporaries called the salt famine. It was an invisible enemy, slow, merciless, without swords, without arrows. It killed not in battle, but in the silence of the march, when feet tangled from weakness and eyes blurred from the heat. It all began during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, when Roman troops advanced deep into North Africa, trying to subjugate the Garamantes tribes. Sandstorms cut off supply routes, and salt convoys disappeared into seas of sand. Historians differ on exactly how many legionaries perished then, but even by the most cautious estimates, thousands. Polybius wrote that the losses were worse than a defeat in battle. Without salt, warriors lost water faster than they could drink. Cramps, hallucinations, internal bleeding appeared. The legion was turning into a dying caravan. One of the archaeological camps found near the Gadames oasis provided evidence of that tragedy. Archaeologists discovered charred campfires and ceramic vessels which were supposed to store salt supplies. They were empty. Instead of white crystals, sand, burying life. Nearby, the remains of dozens of mules fallen from exhaustion. Everything pointed to one thing: the convoys did not arrive. It was then that the Romans realized that salt was not just food, but a strategic resource, equal to iron and grain. The absence of salt turned a legion into a mob. To prevent new tragedies, Rome began to strengthen its network of warehouses and outposts along trade routes. These warehouses were called Chorea Salis, salt storehouses. They stood at a distance of a day's march from each other. They were guarded by prefects, officers personally appointed by the legate. A prefect was not just a warehouse manager, he was responsible for the lives of thousands of people. Salt became an instrument of power. it was stockpiled like a weapon and used as a means of punishment. During rebellions or betrayals, the empire imposed a sanction called interdictio salis, prohibition of salt. A city that dared to raise a hand against Rome was deprived of salt supplies. This meant not just an economic blow, it was a death sentence. Without salt, diseases began, meat rotted, alliances disintegrated, even wealthy patricians begged for forgiveness just to get the white crystals back into their amphorae. Plutarch wrote that after the revolt in Numidia, entire families sold their children to buy a bag of salt. So deeply had Rome integrated it into the economy of conquered territories. Salt ceased to be merely a mineral. It became a symbol of subjugation. Even peace treaties were concluded with a ritual. The parties dipped bread in salt as a sign of eternal loyalty. This tradition survived centuries. From it was born the expression to eat a pud of salt with someone, meaning to share trials and trust with a person. Thus, salt transformed into a language through which Rome spoke to the world. But behind this brilliance lay a harsh reality. Those who controlled salt also controlled life. To avoid new supply failures, Rome created special troops for guarding salt routes. They were called cohortes salinariae, salt cohorts. These units did not participate in battles, but their service was no less dangerous. They escorted convoys through mountains, swamps, deserts. Their enemies were not only bandits, but nature itself. Rains dissolved the salt, heat melted it. Every bag had to be protected like a sacred relic. One centurion, whose name is preserved on an inscription in Campania, left a simple but terrible line: "We died so that others would not die from salt." These words are carved on a stone slab found at the site of a former post on the Via Salaria. Archaeologists believe this is the only evidence of the demise of a salt cohort, completely wiped out en route. But it was after these events that Rome understood. Salt is the blood of the empire, and to lose it means to lose power. Therefore, emperors began to build new roads, bridges, and even cities around salt sources. The city of Ostia, a port at the mouth of the Tiber, became the main center for salt supplies. From here, salt went to all legions, to all fronts. However, the price of this white power was terrible. For every amphora of salt, not only gold was paid, but also the lives of slaves, mules, and soldiers. And the further the empire expanded, the harder it was to maintain this flow. For the more Rome possessed, the more it depended on salt. And dependence is always a weakness. It is this weakness that would one day become a weapon against the empire itself. From the beginning of the 3rd century AD, clouds gathered over Rome. The empire was cracking under the weight of its own victories. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers stood on the borders, from the Rhine to the Euphrates, and all of them needed salt. Without it, army discipline crumbled, bodies weakened, morale plummeted. But trade routes, once reliable, now teemed with rebellious tribes, raiders, and deserters. Even the mighty Via Salaria was no longer safe, and for the first time in centuries, the white crystals, a symbol of order and power, became a cause of chaos. Pliny the Younger wrote that during the crisis years, salt convoys became rare, and legions in the north were forced to salt meat with seawater. This saved them from starvation, but not from disease. Without pure salt, warriors lost strength. Chronicles mention that during a campaign against the Germans, a legion commanded by Legate Valerian lost half its strength without a single battle. Bodies decomposed from infections. Wounds did not heal, all due to the lack of salt, which was used for washing and consumption. At this time, in the shadow of economic decline, speculators rose. Salt became a weapon of profit. Wealthy landowners bought up its supplies and sold them to the army at exorbitant prices. In response, the empire introduced strict control. A new tax appeared, vectigal salis, which taxed every amphora. The tax was collected by special officials, praefecti salinarum. They wielded enormous power and often abused it. Salt, which had been the source of Rome's strength, turned into a source of corruption. One ancient author wrote, "Where salt ends, order ends." And these words proved prophetic. When rebellions began in the provinces, the rebels' first step was to seize salt warehouses. In Africa, in the city of Leptis Magna, insurgents dumped salt supplies into the harbor to paralyze deliveries. It was an act of desperation and defiance, a symbolic killing of the empire. Rome responded brutally. Emperor Diocletian, restoring order, issued an edict by which salt theft was equated with treason. Criminals were punished by death through crucifixion. But even this horror did not restore order. Salt again slipped away, into the sand, into the black market, to the enemies. To maintain power, Rome tried to turn salt into an instrument of state control. Special military warehouses managed by garrisons were created. Soldiers were again paid part of their wages with salt. The old salarium returned as a reminder of the Republic's times. It was a step of desperation, but also a symbol of hope. At the same time, an ancient ritual was revived. Before an oath of loyalty, soldiers ate bread with salt. This simple gesture signified an alliance with the empire, trust, a sacred duty. Even when coins depreciated, salt remained a solid currency. There was something immutable, almost divine about it. It did not obey the market, only nature and time. But nature retaliated. The waters of the Mediterranean receded, salt flats were depleted, and the empire increasingly turned to conquered lands, draining their resources. In Gaul, in Britain, in Spain, wherever salt was extracted, Roman garrisons faced local uprisings. People did not want to give up the white gold. For them, it became a symbol of subjugation. Archaeologists in Gaul found an inscription on the wall of an ancient storehouse. Salt is the blood of the empire, and we are its slaves. These words, scratched with a knife on stone, are a cry of the era. For salt truly flowed through Rome's veins, but the more the empire drank of it, the faster the end approached. When the 4th century came, Rome became dependent on salt supplies from distant provinces. Any loss of a route meant catastrophe. Goths, Vandals, and Sarmatians quickly understood this. They did not always launch a frontal attack. They blocked roads, burned warehouses, sank convoys. They did not fight with the sword, they fought with salt. There is evidence that in 410 AD, during Alaric's invasion, the salt warehouses on the approaches to Rome were among the first targets. Without salt, diseases began in the garrisons, and the soldiers, weak and desperate, could not hold the walls. Perhaps this was the first time the empire fell not by the sword, but by a crystal. But even at this moment, when Rome burned, salt did not disappear. People continued to store it, exchange it, hide it. For them, it remained a symbol of life. When everything collapsed, only salt reminded them of order, of how, once, an empire could measure its power not by gold, but by white crystals that saved soldiers and built roads. Thus, the Roman Empire approached its limit, weakened but still proud. And although the swords of enemies already clanged at the gates, the memory of salt, of what held the army, the people, and faith, lived on. For as long as people remembered its taste, they remembered what it meant to be Roman. But the most surprising thing is that salt outlived the empire, and in how it remained after Rome, how it became part of a new Europe, lies the final paradox of this story. For what saved legionaries from death, centuries later, also saved civilization itself. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, many believed that, with its demise, the memory of all it had created would also vanish. But salt remained. It, strangely enough, outlived legions, temples, and even language. For what began as a soldier's pay became the foundation of Europe's new economy. Salt, a legacy that Rome left to the world without erecting columns or monuments. After the fall of the empire, the roads along which convoys of white crystals had traveled for centuries did not become empty. They were still called Via Salaria, and now not legions but merchants, monks and peasants moved along them. Archaeological finds show that even centuries later, warehouses covered with the same type of stonework continued to exist in the same places. The system built by the Romans proved so well conceived that it outlived its creators. In the early Middle Ages, salt became the foundation of new power. Cities that grew on the ruins of Roman salt storehouses, Ostia, Marseille, Genoa, turned into trading centers. What was once military logistics became a commercial empire. People who controlled salt possessed wealth. This power was as absolute as the centurion's power over a legion once was. It was then that a new word was born: salary, a direct descendant of the Roman salarium. It spread throughout Europe, preserving its essence. Labor must be paid with what sustains life. Even when silver replaced salt in purses, the idea remained the same. Money is just another form of the white crystal, a symbol of energy, survival, power. Salt also entered the rituals of the new era. Christian monks called it God's gift, used it for consecrating water, for protecting dwellings. In the chronicles of 8th century monasteries it was recorded, "He who keeps salt keeps life." This sounded like an echo of old Rome, only now in a different light. But perhaps the most important legacy of salt is in the memory of how it connected people. Of all the elements by which Rome governed the world, salt was the most human. It required labor, discipline, patience. It could not be faked, could not be obtained without sweat, and in this there was its own justice. Salt united the rich and the poor, the soldier and the merchant, the emperor and the peasant. All of them depended on one taste. When archaeologists find ancient salt amphorae with legionary stamps, inside are the same crystals as 2000 years ago. They have not changed. And looking at them, it's hard not to feel a strange respect, for these crystals witnessed the rise and fall of the world's greatest power. Salt was the last witness of the empire. When power fell, when eagles and banners disappeared, it remained lying in the earth, pure, eternal, incorruptible. And perhaps in this lies Rome's greatest lesson. All the gold in the world will not outlive what gives life. But the history of salt did not end with the fall of the empire. On the contrary, from this moment it would begin a new path that changed the entire continent. The white roads along which the legions marched became the arteries of medieval Europe, and the ancient salt warehouses the foundation of the first city-states. Rome fell, but its salt continued to flow through the veins of history. And in this there is a special symbol. The empire's strength disappeared, but the strength of life remained. And it is this that will lead us to the final secret of this story. How salt, which began as payment for blood and labor, became a symbol of human resilience. The taste of salt is the taste of life itself. It was known by legionaries marching through the desert, monks storing amphorae in monastery cellars, and people living today not even suspecting that every word salary is an echo of the ancient salarium. In this word still lives the breath of Rome, the rhythm of its steps, the clang of metal, the crackle of campfires, and the taste of sweat on soldiers' lips. Salt became not just a symbol of labor, it became a symbol of the enduring human spirit, that which makes us alive. When we say today that a person is worth their bread and salt, we are repeating a formula that the legions knew. Salt is energy, order, survival. The Romans understood an army is held together not by the commander's shout, but by the taste of salt in a soldier's mouth. It did not allow the body to give up, did not let the mind fade. It was what connected a person to the earth and to themselves. Archaeologists still find salt mines where traces of ancient peaks, bare footprints, and torch-scorched walls are preserved. These places are silent chronicles, where there is no gold or marble, but there is sweat and labor. Salt does not scream, but it holds the truth, and in this truth there is strength. For empires crumble, but what gives life remains. Historians believe that it was the control over salt that formed the foundations of the first taxation systems and state administration. From Rome, this idea passed to Byzantium, and from there to Europe. Even the modern economy, where every effort has a price, is rooted in a time when a legionary received a handful of salt and knew that it was his life. Salt saved armies, but it also taught empires humility. It reminded them that power cannot exist without care for people. When legions lost salt, they lost strength. When the empire stopped valuing it, it began to crumble. The white crystal proved wiser than swords and laws. It showed it is not the strongest who survives, but he who knows how to preserve what nourishes life. And therefore, when we read the chronicles of Caesar or Tacitus, which speak of campaigns, victories and downfalls, it is important to remember, behind every hero, behind every battle, stood those who carried salt. Without them, there would be no maps, no roads, no empire. These nameless people, whose hands smelled of sweat and the sea, created the foundation of the world we live in. Rome fell, but its salt remained within us. It lives in every effort, in every drop of sweat, in every choice not to give up when it's hard. Salt is the memory of resilience, transformed into substance. It is the breath of all who once marched under the scorching sun, holding a sword and a small pouch of white grains. And, perhaps, when we open the salt shaker on the table today, we are repeating that same ancient gesture. We are touching history. Not monumental, not heroic, but human. A history where strength was measured not by gold, but by endurance. Where power was born not from fear, but from respect for what nourishes life. And now, having learned that Rome was held not by the sword, but by salt, it is worth asking ourselves, could we live even one day in that world where every handful of salt meant salvation? Where the price of labor was measured not by coins, but by sweat and loyalty? Perhaps this is what makes us heirs of those who walked the roads of Via Salaria. Not heroes, but people for whom life was worth the taste of salt. Salt is more precious than gold, not because it is harder to obtain, but because without it, gold means nothing. This is the ultimate truth of Rome, which has survived centuries. The taste of salt, the taste of strength, loyalty, and memory. And as long as a person remembers this taste, as long as they are capable of working, enduring, and preserving, Rome lives within them.